screen. And okay, how does this work?
Oh, I didn't know you were in class. I'm really sorry, but I just wanted to know if you're back.
Okay, so thank you so much for having me and for that extremely generous introduction. Let me just get started. So this paper is called Foreign Aid and State Capacity in Uganda. It is a co-authored work with my colleague Erica De Serrano, who actually got her PhD at the LSE. So she's a bit of an alum for you guys. And Aisha Nansamba, who works with an NGO in Liberia. And let me just quickly motivate. So foreign aid aims to create sustainable development in poor countries. Over 53 years, around $3.5 trillion US dollars were given by OECD countries to poor countries. And around 600 billion, I'm just doing some rounding, went to Africa. Now, this is a lot of money, no matter how you count it. And people have been concerned. And the main concern is that aid doesn't seem to have worked, especially with respect to its main objective of creating sustainable development. If anything, people have argued that aid is increasing aid dependence. And what do they say specifically? Well, there's two. I would put the main complaints or the main criticisms into two bins. One is that aid seems to be more tied to the donor's strategic objectives than to the needs of poor countries. And the other complaint is the moral hazard complaint that, you know, if many poor countries are poor because their governments aren't doing the things that they're supposed to do. And if the governments can just rely on money from foreign countries, then it's not really incentivized to improve its institutions. So together, the ultimate criticism is that, you know, foreign aid is not creating sustainable development. In fact, if anything, it's increasing aid dependence for the future. I think someone hasn't muted.
Yeah, I took care of that.
It happens. I do that all the time. Don't worry. Okay, so you know, there's another. So in this environment, in the which I would say is like the 90s and early 2000s, NGOs emerged as like a shining light of hope. It's like a beacon of hope. And why do we like NGOs so much in the aid community? Well, NGOs are known to be more independent from the objectives of large donors like, you know, the US, the EU, the World Bank. It's more independent. So, and it's also giving money to countries that are actually poor, right? So this is shown. So because of that, in the last 20 years, the amount of aid administered by NGOs have more than quadrupled. At the same time, people have started to express concerns for NGOs. And one of the main ones is that NGOs don't coordinate with each other or with governments, and they offer very high wages, much higher than the local labor market. And what this means is that many workers who would work for the government as doctors, teachers, they end up working for NGOs, right? And then people talk about the local brain drain, that the NGOs come, they pay a lot of money, they hire all of the local skilled labor supply that the government would actually need to build up its own capacity to help the poor. And then, you know, Mbisa Moyo goes a step further in her 2009 book, Dead Aid, and said, well, you know, that reduces state capacity, but it's even worse. Like, what about when the NGOs leave? One day they will leave, and when they leave, the country might be in worse shape than if they had never come, because when they leave, the local population will no longer have the NGOs for help, and the government will not have had the opportunity to build up its capacity to help the poor. So these are the larger concerns in the background of our study. So the research question we want to address is, does NGO administered aid help or hinder state capacity? Like, are these worries, do they actually bear out in the data? Or, you know, are they just, you know, a few examples in an otherwise rosy picture? Okay. So why do we need to do an empirical study? Well, the existing arguments, though quite compelling, are based on anecdotes and impressionistic. And what we really want is some systematic data to tell us whether this is true or not. And if true, like how is it happening? Like, you know, the art is in the details, so to speak. So the main difficulties, of course, is that we don't really have great data to measure state capacity in the very, very poor context. You know, so for those of you guys who study Tilly and his work, when we think he's the one who coined the phrase state capacity, and we typically think of state capacity as the ability of the national government to collect taxes, and this is very relevant for the historical European context that Charles Tilly was studying. But in the very, very poor context, this is not the most relevant measure. Another issue is just identification, right? Like, how does causality work? If we look at the data, I mean, I'll tell you, if you look at the cross-country data, you will see that state capacity is lower in places that's getting more foreign aid. But does that mean that foreign aid is reducing state capacity, or that foreign aid goes to places with low state capacity? We don't know which way the causality goes, right? And then similarly, low state capacity and aid could both be outcomes of other issues like conflict. So places that have conflict are going to be more likely to get aid and to have lower state capacity. So our study is going to try to deal with these two issues of data limitation and causality. Okay, so how are we going to do that? We're going to exploit random variation in aid rollout from an RCT, it's a field experiment, and then we're going to measure the number of government workers who provide similar services as the NGO, and also just the amount of services that the government provides. Those are going to be our measures of state capacity, right? This is the state's ability to provide basic health services for the very poor. And we're looking at the effect of the entry of an NGO that's providing those same services on the government. Okay, we're looking at a very poor population in rural Uganda. So the aid is being delivered by a very large foreign NGO. The rollout of the NGO is random for evaluation purposes. And one thing that's important to note is that, well, two things. One is that the government and the NGO both offer the same things and they have the same aims, which is to improve basic health service provision. The second thing to note is that the NGO offers much, much higher compensation for the workers in the government. And this is common in aid contexts. Okay, so what do we think is gonna happen? Ex ante, it's actually hard to know. You know, I gave you all those stories about how higher wages paid by the NGO is going to poach government workers and reduce government capacity. That's true. But there's also a flip side to this, right? Like in a context where people don't have any access or knowledge of modern healthcare, having the NGO show up and educating the villagers or demonstrating to the villagers the value of basic health services like antibiotics for infections, going to the hospital to give birth to reduce mortality. Having the NGO demonstrate that could actually increase the demand for the services or increase the number of people who are willing to work for the government to provide healthcare services. So we don't actually know which way it's going to go ex ante. Okay, so what do we find? I'll give you a preview of the results in case we don't get to the end in 40 minutes, which we probably won't. I'm trying to check time. I have an Apple Watch 2, which is really outdated, and it actually doesn't work that well.
I can also give you like
right.
a 5-minute warning or something, like just a little.
Yeah, that would be great. I think it'll work.
Okay.
But a warning would be great. So we're gonna find, what we find is that the NGO when the NGO enters, the number of government workers providing the same services declines. The number of government provided health services in the village declines. And all of this is happening in villages that already had a government health worker. So basically, when the NGO enters, half of the villages already have a government health worker, and the NGO just crowds out those government health workers. It hires those government health workers, and the government and government services dissipates. And then, but in other villages where there was no government health worker to begin with, when the NGO enters, it doesn't affect, it doesn't increase recruitment of a government health worker. So we don't see that positive spillover that could have been possible. But in terms of health, it just increases. I mean, it's definitely better for the people to have someone versus no one. So what we take away from these results is that NGO reduces state capacity. Now, what are the policy implications? Well, the policy implications really depends on a lot of stuff. We can't just say, oh, because NGO entry reduces state capacity, then it's bad and we shouldn't let NGOs, right? I mean, we have to take a step back. Why do NGOs enter in the first place? They enter because these places are very, very poor, and the people, this is an area with one of the highest infant mortality in the world. So even though the government is trying to provide is trying to build up some infant infrastructure, we still have to consider the possibility that the NGO can provide better care and hence save more lives. So even though it's crowding out the government, and that could be bad, in the long run, we have to take into consideration the benefits that it brings to the population in the short run for policy design. So what we're going to look at is the NGO entry on total service provision and health outcomes. And what we find is that NGOs, when they enter villages already with a government health worker, NGO services go up. But, when we enter villages without a government health worker, with no one, people go from having no services to some services, infant mortality goes down, and some health behaviors improve. But in villages with a health worker, when the NGO enters, it hires the health worker, and total services go down, and infant mortality increases, and health behavior of children gets worse. So this is just consistent with a limited supply of skilled workers and poaching being a big problem. In other words, for the villages that already had a health worker, NGO entry is strictly bad, both now and for the future. But in the villages that didn't have a health worker, NGO entry is strictly good, because it gave people who had access to no healthcare access to some healthcare. So there's a lot of work about aid. I don't have a lot of time. I'm going to skip it. If you guys are interested, these are referenced in this paper, which is on my website. And I have another paper that's actually just a literature review about foreign aid that's called Making Progress on Foreign Aid in the Annual Review of Economics. It just gives you the literature overview in a very non-technical way if you're interested in this topic. Okay, so let me push ahead. So I'm going to talk a bit about the background. I'll talk about the main results, and then I'll talk about the results on well-being and conclude. So a lot of the robustness checks and the details, they're in the slides, but I'm going to just skip ahead. I'll probably skip them because of time constraints. Okay, we are looking at a place that it is exceptionally poor. Per capita income in Uganda is $522. So that's urban and rural. Urban areas are much richer than rural areas. We're looking at rural areas, and we are looking at some of the poorest rural areas within Uganda. I don't have data on per capita income in our context, but it's very low. It's gonna be around $1 a day, just ballpark. So there is little access to medical care. The only access to modern medicine are from home visits by the government health workers and the NGOs that we study. The other medical providers are traditional healers that do, like they do herbal medication, faith healing, prayers, a lot of varying animist practices. And then there are drugstores that dispense medication, and sometimes they'll give some advice with the medication. They'll say, and this is aspirin, take it when you have a headache, take it when you have a fever, don't take more than 4 per day, that type of advice. In urban areas, there are clinics and government hospitals and health centers, but these are typically These are often far away, and it's costly for the, for people of the village to go there. I mean, they can do it, but it's costly. The government health program provides free basic health services during home visits. And this includes education about the benefits of hospital delivery, disease prevention, washing your hands. It includes postnatal checkups and basic medical advice. So what's an example of basic medical advice? For example, for pregnant women, they can feel the pregnancy to see if the baby has turned appropriately so the head is facing down. And if it hasn't and you're facing a breech birth, she'll say you really need to give birth in you really need to give birth in the urban hospital, and I'll help you coordinate that visit. And I give that example on purpose because later we're going to look at mortality, and you're going to be like, how can these services affect mortality so much? They're giving advice to people. This is a place where without that advice, that woman would have given a home birth, and that home birth would have very likely resulted in the infant dying. Whereas a breech birth in a clinic with antibiotics and a trained medical professional almost never results in infant mortality. So we have high returns of these services. Okay, so they also give some medicines free of charge. All of the workers are given basic training, uniform, and then free medicines for distribution. This government was rolled out in 2009. All the workers are recruited locally. They can be men or women, but in practice, in our sample, they're all women. They're unpaid volunteers. So these women are not paid anything. They're part-time volunteer workers. And why are they doing this? Well, they're doing this because they want to help their they want to help their community. Why do they want to help? Maybe it's for the ego. Maybe it's for prestige. Maybe it's just to be nice. So all of that we can think of altruism, right? As economists. So by the time, after a year of rollout, only half of the villages had a volunteer health worker. The main issue was finding someone who could do the job, like they have the ability, they're educated, they're also rich enough to do a part-time job for free. And there's someone that the community trusts because they're making home visits in a very conservative society. So women have to be willing to let them into their homes and believe what they say. So they have to have the ability to do the job, and they have to be willing to do the job. So it's hard to find someone. It was very difficult to find someone. And they were able to find one worker per village. Something that's very important to note, the government did not have the capacity to keep a record of where the health workers are. So local offices know where the local workers are, but there's no aggregate data. So the Ugandan government, if you ask the Ugandan government, can you tell me where all of the government health workers are? They'll just be like, no, I can't. We don't have data on that. And that's just important to keep in mind for our 20-minute discussion, where I'm sure you guys will want to talk about policy implications. Okay, the NGO we study is one of the largest in the world. The aims are the same as the government. They want to reduce infant and maternal mortality and improve basic health. They provide exactly the same health services as the government in exactly the same way by making home visits also free of charge. On top of that, they sell stuff, household commodities that are related to improving the well-being of the household at a piece rate. So things like they sell will be like, condoms, fortified oil, soap. And the health workers, when they make the home visits, they provide the health services, and they also sell these commodities to the households. And then the income they get from the commodities pays their wage so that the NGO is able to provide these free services in a way that's financially sustainable without large donations from institutional donors. So that's a business model, and it's called the Avon model. And we'll come back to this. Yeah, is there a question? Okay, so that's called the Avon model, and that's actually very interesting. We'll talk more about it later. Now, the NGO also recruits people locally, men or women, but in practice, again, all women. And they try to avoid hiring government workers, but they have no way to systematically screen them out as of now. Okay, so let me see. I'm just gonna skip ahead. So let me tell you about the data. Well, first, actually, let me pause. Are there any clarification questions about what the NGO and the government programs do? And if you have a question, I can't see you all, just unmute and ask away.
Hello, Professor. Can I just ask if the program was based on collaboration with a big NGO as opposed to many small different NGO programs in Uganda?
So I don't understand the question. Do you mind
Sorry.
asking? No problem.
I was just wondering if the trial was based on working with a big NGO organization. For example, I have an NGO A, rather than, for example, if I'm working with NGO A and B and C, so it's based on working with one NGO as opposed to working with multiple NGOs.
Oh, sure, I understand. So we only work with one NGO, and just to be completely transparent, we didn't design the RCT. So the RCT we evaluate is one that the NGO did for an internal evaluation, and we had when we were working and talking to them for other reasons. And at some point, we communicated our interest to understand the relationship of NGO and how it affects local government capacity. And we needed a context where we had variation in NGO rollout and the presence of the government. And so in talking to this, they told us they did this evaluation in 2010 and they never used it for an evaluation. It was one of these things that happens. And they said, well, here's the data, you guys can use it. And that's why we use it. But actually, I'll talk about this later. The business model we study and the context that we study, it's very common across NGOs, which is, good and bad. Okay, any other questions?
Thank you so much.
Now we're on to quite some questions, not all of them, but like one thing that I thought of is the policing bias. So so obviously the countries which you are working with within the study and are receiving the aid from the NGO, they might have better institutions or even different institutions from the countries that don't receive aid from the NGO. So I'm just wondering how that would affect results in a general equilibrium setting.
So you should think about this as a general equilibrium result, right? In the sense that we're looking at the spillovers of the NGO onto government workers. This isn't the type of an experiment where scaling up is going to be very different because of general equilibrium effects, because we already captured the price effects. So when we look at the effects, we look at the effects of the NGO rollout on government employees and government services, we are capturing the general equilibrium price effects. Like, that's already there. Okay. So I'm gonna keep going because I think since we have the discussion at the end, I wanna save the time for now for just clarification questions if there's anything that I'm saying is unclear, because I don't wanna lose people as I keep going. But general discussion questions I would love to talk about, but I will postpone for the end. Okay, a few things about data. So the government, just a timeline, the government rolled out in 2009, it was non-random. The NGO collected a baseline in 2010, then did a random rollout. We have 2 surveys at the village level and the household level. In 2010, we have the Ugandan census data, which we did not collect, but we have, and we can use it, to enrich our analysis, controls, balance checks, so on and so forth. In 2012, we have the N-line survey from the NGO. So our effects you should think about as short or medium run, because we're looking at effects 2.5 years out from NGO entry. Okay, so I am just gonna, so NGO workers earn about $19 US dollars for 13 hours per week. So to give you a sense of how much money that is, that's 51%. So an NGO worker in 13 hours earns half of the average Ugandan household income. That's a lot of money. And I'm gonna skip this. This is just to show that the randomization is very balanced, everything's great, it's all in the paper, it's a lot of numbers, and they all say the same thing. So I'll just keep going. So the first thing I wanna look at is I wanna look at the effect, I wanna look at the effect of NGO entry on the number of health workers. That's from the government, from the NGO, and in total. And for this, I'm going to divide my sample into villages that already had a government worker in 2010 and villages that did not have a government worker in 2010. And I'm dividing the villages just because the effects can be different depending on whether there's already a government health worker there. So columns 1 to 3, I look at the first type of villages that already had a government health worker in 2010. And what I find is that column 1 shows me that when the NGO enters, the number of government health workers in these villages goes down by 0.43. So another way of saying it is for every 2 villages that the NGO enters, about 1 village is going to lose their government health worker. Column 2 says that when the NGO enters a village, the number of NGO health workers go up by 1. So what that says is every village that the NGO enters, it successfully hires a health worker. So column 3 is a total number of health workers. And this is mechanical. It's essentially, you know, the effect on NGO workers minus the effect on government health workers. So not surprisingly, you see 0.57. So column 4 and 6, we look at the villages that have no health worker from the government to begin with. So column 4 says when the NGO enters a village with no government health worker, there continues to be no government health worker. Column 5 says that when the NGO enters a village with a government health worker, without a government health worker, it again hires 1 worker in every village for the NGO. Column 6 also says it's just the sum of the 2 columns like before. Okay. The next slide, we're gonna look at services. So this is a household questionnaire, and we asked households, did you receive medical care from the following in the past year? And they can check a box for the government, if they saw a government health worker, if another box, if they saw an NGO health worker, and then, and if they saw both, they can check both boxes. There's nothing to preclude that. And what we find is that in villages with a government health worker, when the NGO enters, they are 25 percentage points less likely to see a government health worker for medical advice. They are 31.5 percentage points more likely to see an NGO worker. Okay, and then I'll come back to column 3 later. When we look at villages that had no government health worker to begin with, we find that when the NGO enters, oh, this is a typo. It should be columns 4 and 5, the numbers should be reversed. So column 4 should say that when an NGO enters, there's no effect on getting medical advice from the government health worker. Column 5 should say that when the NGO enters, they are 31 percentage points more likely to get health advice from the NGO worker. Okay, so what do we learn from state capacity, about state capacity? We learned that in a village with a government health worker, NGO entry reduces the number of government health workers by 1 per every 2 villages. It reduces the amount of government health services. And this is all consistent with poaching, right? in the descriptive statistics, we actually see that in these villages, 40% of the time, the NGO just hires a former government health worker. So this is all going to increase the total, there's an increase in the total number of health workers because the number of NGO health workers increases more than the decline in the government health worker. Okay. In villages without a government health worker, NGO entry has no effect on the number of government health workers or services, and it increases the amount of services from the NGO. So what we find is that the NGO reduces state capacity on the intensive margin, but it has no effect on state capacity in the extensive margin. So now let's take a deeper look at the intensive margin. For the villages with a government health worker and that gets an NGO, half of them, in 2012, when we look at them 2 years later, half of them have 2 workers. The NGO hired a second worker. Half of them has 1 worker. The NGO hired the government worker. Right, so this is sort of important because this is really detailed evidence on poaching. It's systematic evidence that the NGO is poaching. Now, again, now let's think a little bit about policy. Well, this isn't great because this increases this might increase aid dependence for the future. But what if the NGO can provide better service provision and healthcare now so that people are just better off with the NGO entry today? I mean, that would also matter and has to factor in to the policymakers' mind. Let me just check time. Oh, I have 4 minutes. So for that, let's look at well-being. What is the effect on well-being? And I'm just gonna go ahead and into the results because we only have 5 minutes left. So first, let's look at total services. So this is a probability of getting any healthcare from anyone. What we find is that in villages that had a government health worker and an NGO worker, had a government health worker, when the NGO enters, total healthcare access goes down by 11.6 percentage points. In villages where there wasn't a government health worker, you know, it increases. It's great. So what I'm going to do now is look at mortality. And when I look at mortality, I'm going to pull the data. So this is exactly what we were doing before. So I'm looking at the villages with a government health worker. That would be this guy, this variable being 1. I'm looking at these villages and the other villages separately. But because mortality is a rare event, for statistical power, I need to pull the data and estimate an interaction equation. So if I want to know the effect of NGO entry on villages without a government worker, I only need to look at the gamma coefficient. If I want to know the effect of entry of NGO on a village with a government worker, I would need to look at the sum of beta plus gamma. So this is what is it? It's a refresher for those of you guys that have already studied interaction effects, and for those of you that haven't, they're great. It's something for you to look forward to. Okay, but let's look at infant mortality. And what do we find here? What this coefficient shows us is that in villages without a government health worker, NGO entry reduces infant mortality. In villages with a government health worker, when the NGO enters, infant mortality actually goes up. And it goes up regardless of whether we look at whether a household experienced an infant death, this is the dummy variable, or death per 1,000. But these results are not very precise. The p-values are almost precise or just imprecise here. So let's go a step further. Let's go a step further and further break up the villages that had a government health worker into the villages where the NGO hired the government worker, where he poached, and where the NGO hired a new worker. Okay, so when we do this, something really interesting happens. We see that if they hire the government worker, infant mortality goes up by a lot. This is 8 percentage points, right? So this is 82 per 1,000 deaths. This is 8 percentage points, and this is 53 per 1,000 deaths. And these are almost significant. These are significant or almost significant. Interestingly, if we look at the villages where the NGO didn't hired a second person, then there's no effect. And this is really interesting because it's basically telling us that it is precisely, we already know that poaching is a problem, and it is precisely in the villages where the NGO poaches that we see an increase in infant mortality. In the other villages, we don't see this adverse effect. And we can look at a bunch of other health outcomes like behavior and disease rates. The estimates are either imprecise, they're always the same sign, and some of them are precise and some of them aren't. But certainly there's nothing that go the other way as mortality. We do a lot of robustness checks. And just to stay on time, let me conclude, and then we can talk more in our 20 minutes. The NGO reduces state capacity, but the effect is heterogeneous. Reduces state capacity in places where the government is already building capacity. In places where the government has not built any capacity, it has no impact on the government, but it just increases total services. So what do we learn from this? What we learn from this is that the concerns of aid workers and aid critics bear out in the data that NGOs could potentially have this, NGOs, at least in our context, has this unintended consequence of crowding out the government and undermining the development of government capacity. At the same time, you know, the fact that we find that in places with no government workers, NGOs just make everything better, it increases services, it reduces mortality. This is also, it's very reassuring to people who believe in NGOs in the first place, because NGOs are supposed to be a stopgap when there's no government services. So this means that it's very good at fulfilling its original mission of providing services where there are no government to the very poor, right? So what are the policy implications? And this we can talk about in the next 20 minutes. To me, what I learned from this is that there's a lot of room for improvement. That NGOs are really good at fulfilling its original mission and doing some really valuable things for the poor, but there's room for improvement. NGOs should really pay attention to the calls for it to coordinate with the government and to pay local market wages. And one thing that we haven't talked much about is the parallel task model used by this NGO, and actually many, many NGOs these days, which is this idea that they can sell things while providing free services to be financially self-sustainable. So on the one hand, that's great because it makes them more self-independent from large donors. On the other hand, one of the things we show in this paper, and which I haven't had time to get into in our 40 minutes, is that the NGO workers, because they make money from selling, they just spend all their time selling stuff and very little time providing free services. And one thing we show in the paper is that they don't even visit the households, the poorest households. They only visit households that can afford to buy stuff. And this is problematic, obviously, since we think that it is precisely the poorest households that need the free public services. Okay, so I'm gonna end there. I'm gonna stop sharing screen, and I encourage everyone to go to gallery view so that we can have you know, a discussion that's almost as if we were in person. Okay, I'm in gallery view. I don't know if anyone else is.
All right, guys.
Questions?
So,
yeah.
If anyone has any questions, please put in the chat. I can read them out loud or ask away.
Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for your time to deliver the talk. I guess I have a quick question about how do we distinguish the role of NGOs in different contexts between substituting and complementing? For example, it might be thinking that there are certain public goods that the NGOs are not able to substitute for, such as overseeing or enforcing environmental regulations. But without better variation, I can't exactly know if the presence of stronger NGO network is promoting local governments to enforce environmental regulations, or substituting or crowding out their oversight role. So what would you say is maybe a plausible way to even think about the issue from observational data without having the kind of variation we can have to identify this relationship?
Sure. So I think so that's a great point. Let me just rephrase your question a little bit. I think you're saying, can I study this law? Can I study the question of whether NGOs are substitutes or complements for government provided services, or in your case would be like, environmental regulation monitoring, without a randomized experiment? And the answer is absolutely yes, right? So, but you just have to be really careful. You just have to, you can construct a natural experiment, for example, that's policy driven. Imagine if you found a context where there were already NGOs monitoring environmental issues, and then the government introduces a policy where they also monitor, and then you can do a before and after comparison, or a second difference, before and after government, the government policy between places with and without NGOs. That's just like one example. There are many different types of strategies that economists use when they aren't able to have to conduct a randomized experiment, which I would say actually is like most of the time, right? Because it's not easy to execute a randomized experiment, although it's getting easier and easier these days with the infrastructure that's being built.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question. Would NGOs' implementation of a mechanism to screen out government workers disincentivize people from becoming a government worker in the first place? I'm assuming that the NGO work conditions are more favorable than the government in this case.
I couldn't hear the very first part of what you said. Sorry, I just lost you for a second. Do you mind repeating?
Okay, I'll repeat. Would NGOs' implementation of a mechanism to screen out government workers disincentivize people from becoming a government worker in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I mean, actually, I don't think so, because, and the reason is because this, let me take a step back and talk a little bit about why they don't have a screening mechanism. They don't have a screening mechanism because there's no plausible way to make it work, right? How would you make it work? If you ask people to self-report, they can always lie. And then if you ask, so alternatively, but these are small communities, you can also ask their neighbors, right? So we actually talked to the NGO a lot. We said, well, maybe you can just, why can't you guys just ask other people in the community and ask them who is the government worker? And they said they didn't really want to do that. Like, they didn't want to get into the business of having people report on each other, because this is a context where social trust is very low. Uganda has had a lot of political and ethnic conflict over time. And one of the key challenges in working in this context is that people often don't trust other people, right? And that's why it's so important for them to identify a woman that's respected and trusted by the community, that other women will believe and let into her house and follow her advice. So since they're trying to build trust, they didn't want to get into this thing of having people report on each other, because they saw that as being corrosive to trust at this, like, higher level. So then I guess another way would be to say, well, can we just, what if the government had data, right? Right now, the government doesn't have data that they can share with the NGO en masse. What if they had that and they shared it with the NGO? And I think this is getting closer to your question, like, what if the government just gave the NGO a list of everyone who works for it, and the NGO says you can't apply? I think you're right. The NGO doesn't want to do that, because if the NGO does that, then people won't want to work for the government, which again is bad for building up capacity. So it's actually a tricky problem to screen. So that's why I think when we think about policy, coordination is important, just you don't want to replicate efforts. We think of coordination in the sense that the government is poor, it can't be everywhere, and especially, and in the places, in a lot of places, it tried to recruit someone, but it can't afford to pay, so people couldn't work for them. The NGO in those places were obviously successful in recruiting someone. So to us, in this environment, coordination would be the NGO going to only to places where the government already tried and couldn't recruit someone. We don't think it makes sense for the NGO to coordinate with the government by going to a place where the government already has someone and saying, I'm not going to hire Sally because she works for the government. That, I think, will have like the pernicious effects that you're thinking about.
Okay, thank you.
There's a quick clarification question from the chat. So a student asks, was mortality rate lower under the government provision or the NGO or both?
The mortality rate was lower under the government provision. So the way you should think about it is that with nobody there, mortality rates are very high when there's in villages with no healthcare at all. And then for villages that gets either the government or the NGO, mortality rates come down. For villages that have the government already and then the NGO, mortality rates increase relative to having only the government. But it's still lower than having no healthcare.
Brilliant, thank you.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to ask, having been born in Kenya and spent half of my life there, I'm quite interested in the preferences. So in terms of the locals, do you have any idea of what they prefer in terms of preference, whether it's provision from the NGOs or the government? And do you think that has any impact on the quality of the provision?
Yeah, so that's a really important question. And that's something we've thought a lot about. I don't have any personal insights on the Ugandan context. I haven't spent nearly as much time there as one would need in order to feel comfortable saying I have personal insights. But based on my co-authors Erica and Aisha, worked there a lot. And their sense, when we started this, their sense was that there might be some of it, and it's a little bit mixed. It really did. So some communities feel like the government is incompetent and the NGO is just going to be able to provide much better care. So you might think there's higher take-up with the NGO. So if that's the case, it's even more surprising that we find that when the NGO enters, things are worse than when the NGO enters, it's worse than if they only had the government, right? It sort of goes the opposite way. So another thing that we can think about is trust. So there's also the other way. So there's been a few studies recently. There's a really nice study about the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they show that in places where the colonial powers of the past, the Belgians, did they did very bad things in almost everywhere, but where they did very bad things in terms of medical treatments, like forcibly vaccinating people with things that they knew didn't work and had already banned in Belgium. And those places today, the population is less trusting of foreign NGOs. So they don't like World Bank projects. They don't like foreign projects. They prefer services provided by their own government. So when we looked at that, but I guess for us, we don't think that plays a huge role in our context, because even though our NGO is foreign, everyone in the NGO, from the very top to the local community health workers, they're all local. So this NGO is actually one of this NGO it's a great NGO in the sense that it goes out of its way to take lessons that we've already learned and to try not to repeat it. So it goes out of its way to hire locally. So we don't think that plays a huge role. But these are really important questions.
Okay, thank you so much.
So first of all, I thought this was a fantastic paper and a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much. Secondly, with my question, we all know fundamentally NGOs, they usually have, whether it's Amnesty International or so on, they usually have an agenda to promote. They don't give money without any strings attached. I think fundamentally, you can't separate the goals of the NGOs from where it's implemented. For instance, there are some governments that are more proactive against what they view as NGO influence in their political affairs. So I'm just wondering, you know, how that affects the results of the paper.
Yeah, so that's a really important point. So in the beginning, when I was doing this introduction about NGOs, you know, and how we really, how NGOs have really taken off, and how they, and one of the main reasons for its popularity is the perceived independence from donor objectives and constraints. That doesn't apply to all NGOs, right? In the sense that there are some, an NGO just means that they're not a government organization, but they can have their own agenda, their own objectives. You know, there are Christian NGOs, for example, that are against contraceptives. There are NGOs with a political motivation, like promoting democracy, promoting a certain type of government. There are NGOs from non-democratic regimes that have like a non-democratic agenda. So, but that said, a lot of NGOs today are pretty good about being independent and trying to provide aid that's targeted, providing aid where the only mission is to help the poor, that they don't have strategic objectives or too many constraints. I mean, everyone has moral constraints, right? But they don't have too many constraints. And the one we study is usually thought of as like one of the best ones. But one thing I want to come back to is, to your point, you know, one of the things we didn't have a lot of time to talk about was this parallel task model and getting people to sell stuff in order to pay for free services. You could say, oh, you know, now that we've seen the results, that's so obviously a bad idea, you know, like, of course, you're going to spend all their time selling stuff and not providing free services. Why did they ever do it? Well, the reason they do it was precisely because of what you just said, which is that, you know, NGOs right now, like the biggest NGOs still get like 80% or more of their money from large institutional donors, right? So, and while these institutional donors have been giving more and more money to NGOs, they're not going to give all, like the USAID will never give all of its money to NGOs, because the ultimate purpose of USAID is US foreign policy. So while they want to help people, they're never going to give, there's some point where the NGO either has to accept that they're connected with big donors, or they have to raise money on their own. So that's why they really like the Avon model, because this is really like, you know, it's self-contained, right? Like, I sell you soap, and when I sell you soap, I look at your baby and tell you whether you need to go to the health clinic. And in this way, I can function entirely independent of any big donor and whatever, you know, objectives or constraints they have. So that's like the motivation of this model. And we just find unintended consequences for it.
Thank you.
Professor, if you have time for one more question on the chat.
Sure.
Yeah. We have a question from Eddie, who asks, he says that he's really interested in, he says that we can evaluate medium to long run effects of NGO rollout through other channels as well, such as through behavioral responses of local governments, where they change local provisions of public goods. So is it possible to do that?
So right now it's really hard. That's one of the things we're hoping will change. One of the things we're hoping our paper will influence is just data collection of NGOs. So I've actually been trying to study this question for something like 10 years. And I couldn't because believe it or not, almost no country has a registration of all the NGOs that operate there and what they do. The only country I could find with that registry is China, which doesn't actually allow NGOs for the most part. Foreign NGOs are illegal. So there's not that many, so it's easy to have data. And, and it makes sense because historically NGOs go to places that are so poor where there's no government presence. So there's no government presence, who is there? If there's no government to provide basic healthcare, they're not going to be able to collect data for researchers, right? But that's something that I hope will change. And it's not just me. So for example, I think in the paper, we actually have a footnote, like the Uganda government now is starting a registry of NGOs, but it's voluntary, right? So compliance is voluntary. And similarly, I think there's a few states in India, not the whole country, but a few states that has that's putting together the database. So I think this is something that will be doable soon if it's not doable already, in a smaller scale. So you guys should definitely check, because data is also something that's changing every day.
Thank you.
There's also another question on the chat. Would you have time for this?
Yeah, sure.
So Alexandra asks, she states that your study has clear policy implications. What is the reaction you get from NGOs when you present these findings? Is there any pushbacks or any reactions there?
So I've only talked about this with one NGO, and there's no pushback. I think if anything, it's the opposite. They're actually sort of aware of the fundamental issues. They just didn't know how pervasive it was. And I think the results in infant mortality was a bit shocking for them. But they're sort of aware. I mean, if you look at the paper, a lot of the references are internal studies by the NGOs. So this is not a study this is not like an aha, I got you NGO study. It's not like that at all. This is more of okay, you guys are already talking about this question, this problem, we're all trying to make aid better. But some things are happening despite best intentions. Can we go and evaluate it a bit more rigorously so that we can have some real numbers to work with? It's more, that's more of the flavor of this study. And yeah, so I think the main reaction is just great concern, right? Because it's not obvious how to fix it. And for example, it's easy for me to say you should pay local market wages. But then if they pay local market wages, they're not going to be able to hire people in a lot of places, right? And then there's this question: does that make it better or worse? It's not actually. I think our results have clear policy implications, but it's not actually easy or obvious what to do next, if that makes any sense. Which is why I want people like you guys to get involved.
I'm not sure how much time you have, and I'm really sorry if you have to leave, but we do have a quick question on...
Sure, I can stay for, yeah, we can take another question.
Okay. What are the possible reasons that NGOs provide less efficient healthcare than the government in the RCT?
So I think in this case, that's actually quite clear. We actually, in the paper, we actually provide data on time allocation for these NGO workers. The government worker is working on average 10 hours per week, but they're spending all of that providing healthcare. The NGO workers work around 13, 14 hours a week. They're only spending about 30% of that time providing healthcare. The rest of the time they're selling stuff. So it's really just, they're being incentivized to sell things, and they want to make money. It's not a bad thing. These are very poor women, and And so they're just not, it's a matter of time allocation.
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, thanks guys. Thanks for having me. Thanks for your interest. I like the name of your club. Amartya Sen was one of my heroes. And yeah, and it's kind of cool that I get to see you guys in England or wherever you are. Celine told me that, you know, this is a broader audience than usual.
It's been amazing to have you, Professor Qian. I personally really loved your talk, and I think we can all agree that it was extremely well presented, and the information was given so clearly, and it's also a fascinating topic. So thank you again so much. Everyone, thank you so much for joining. Please join the discussion on the Facebook group. We're actually going to put up your paper, Professor, so people can actually read the entire thing and go through it in more detail. And I am very, very excited for what's to come. So I will hang back in case anyone has any questions for a bit, but Professor, you're more than welcome to jump off. Thank you so much again. This is amazing.
Okay, thanks a lot, guys, and good luck with your studies, research, surviving the lockdown, if you have a lockdown wherever you are, or surviving having no lockdown if there's no lockdown wherever you are. Bye, guys.
All right,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, guys, feel free to hop off. If anyone has any questions or anything, I'm here.
Wow, seeing the numbers decline.
That was really fast.
Like that was fast, like literally dropping.
Oh my God, she was so sweet.
She was like giving verbal footnotes in case you don't understand it.
Oh, that was the clearest. I'm actually going to use that to review for like the exam, the metrics exam, and like that was
Wow,
so clear.
That's okay. Yeah,
That was the best like walk through like a regression table. That was amazing.
yeah. I think it's just like some speakers they think you got the details already, you just move on, and others want to make sure you understand it before they go on with anything else.
That was honestly great. Yeah, everyone doing fine?
Yeah. Okay. I think I gotta go too.
Yeah, go to sleep, dude.
Great meeting you all. Right. See ya. It's like
Catch
4
you
a.m.
later,
for me, so I
guys.
have to go. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Hey, how are you, man? I haven't seen you. Oh, he left. Rip. Okay, guys, I'm gonna hop off right now. I need.
Have a nice evening.
7.
Yeah. See you.
All right, bye, Patrick. See ya, Arian.
Yeah.
Bye, Dr. Shapiro. Bye, Ida.